Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Duff and I am a PhD student at Montana State University studying the effects of ecological refugia and agricultural landscapes. And today I'm just going to share with you some of my first year findings from one organic farm here in Montana. So currently we have a global problem between the need to produce more food to feed a growing population, and yet we have this need to conserve biodiversity as it continues to decline as we continue to use more land for agriculture. So we're looking at the possibility of a potential to conserve on-farm biodiversity and maintain agricultural production through ecological refugia. So what are these? These are just small patch habitats that can be either created on farms or they may already exist. This is an example of a low producing area on an organic farm in Shonkin that the producer took out of production and has planted with native species in order to try and increase habitat for other insects, for example. So they may already exist on your farm and you're not cropping them anyways, or they could be a low producing area you choose to take out because you're losing money there anyways. But what we really want to know is, can these ecological refugia support biodiversity, increase food production, and enhance ecosystem services? So as I mentioned, in order to study this, we selected a farm near Fort Benton, and here we're looking at plant, insect, and small mammal diversity in and around the refugia. So the basis of this idea is that these refugia, even though they're very small patches, they can still harbor some sort of biodiversity. And second, we would expect that their beneficial influence on the crop would decline as you move away from the refuge. Third, we believe they'll be beneficial if they actually decrease weeds or increase pollinators, for example. And fourth, that they'll offer some sort of net return benefit for a producer if they somehow increase crop yield and decrease the amount of inputs a farmer needs to use. So we decided to lay out these transects across the field and into the refuge and look at the plant diversity along the transect, as well as collect insects all along the same transects and see what type of pests and beneficial insects are residing in the refuge and in the crop field itself. And then lastly, we wanted to know what kind of small mammals are living in the field and what type of seeds are they eating. So the first finding from this farm is that there is high plant species richness in the center of the refuge. And plant species richness just means how many types of plants are growing somewhere. So you can see here in the red colors, that means high plant species richness right here in the refuge, whereas in the crop field, as you would expect, the plant species richness is much lower. And so this might seem like an obvious finding that, of course, out in the crop field we have lower plant species richness, but it tells us that even though this refuge isn't a huge chunk of land, it is still harboring biodiversity. So we know that biodiversity can have a beneficial impact on ecosystems and agroecosystems, such as enhanced nutrient cycling, better soil quality, or providing habitat for some beneficial insects. And we see that as you move away from the refuge, we're having lower plant species richness, and so you might imagine that some of our beneficial ecosystem services also decline as you move away from the refuge. So next we wanted to break it down between native and non-native plants in order to understand a little bit better what ecosystem services they may be providing. So we know that native plants like this winterfat shrub are often host to pollinators like these fritillaries. We also see other forbs that harbor beneficial pollinators as well, whereas there's always the threat of non-native species such as wild oat or here Japanese brome that could become a weed problem for farmers, and we like to avoid having those in the refuges. So what we found first was that for native plant species richness, here in the darker colors, we have much higher native plant species richness in the refuge. And as you move out into the crop field, it's basically there are no native species in the crop field. And so on the contrast, for non-native species, we see that there's a much higher non-native species richness in the field, so more weedy species in the field. But there's not a lot of non-native species in the refuge. So this is a good sign that contrary to our fear, these refugia aren't necessarily weed sources. They are, in fact, more so homes for native plants. So next we looked at the insect diversity, and here I'm working on pinning all of them in order to identify them, not to the species level, but you can see that there's quite a bit of variety. This is just from one farm. And we found that the insect species richness also declines as you move away from the refuge. So you can imagine that this might mean there's less pollinators in places without refugia, or as they get farther away from them. There might also be less of these predator insects that are eating harmful pests. But we're going to do more work on classifying these insects into functional groups in order to understand the trade-offs and which ones are beneficial and which ones are harmful. So lastly, we wanted to understand the small mammals living on the farm and what type of seeds they're eating. So we set out these live traps and we baited them and we checked them early in the morning, and out of 120 chances, we caught one sad little deer mouse. And so we're going to try to small mammal sample again next year at a different time. But for this fall, what we did is instead we set out seed traps, which are just a popsicle stick with 4 different types of seeds glued to it. We set them out in the field and we waited for 2 weeks and then collected them and counted how many seeds were eaten from them. And so what we found is that for crop seed predation, which is in this map here, we set out 30 seed traps in the black there, and then the ones that are purple are seed traps where crop seeds were eaten. And so we saw that 8 crop seeds were eaten out of 60 possible, and that it's more likely that the small mammals are preying on crop seeds in the refuge rather than in the field. And so this could be a beneficial service if we think about on the edges. Perhaps they're cleaning up volunteers, but it could be a problem if they're eating newly planted seeds, for example. So this could be a trade-off. However, for weed seed predation, we saw it was very low. They only ate 1 weed seed out of 60 possible. And so once again, we don't know if that means they're not offering the beneficial service of weed seed predation, or if there are just so many weed seeds available they didn't eat any off of the seed traps. So, to conclude, we have a lot more work to do, and so we'll continue identifying, mapping insects and their ecosystem services. And then we have 2 additional farms we have the same sort of data on that I'll continue to analyze so that we can compare all 3. And most importantly, look at some of the crop yield data using precision ag data to see how the crop yield might change with distance from the refuge and if there's any effect at all. And lastly, just quantifying the net benefit and net return benefit associated with refugia. And so I would like to thank Western SARE for funding this project, and a big thanks to our farmer collaborators, Casey Bailey, Oli Norgard, and Gary Broyles, and to my lab group and everyone who's helped with this project. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Love to talk more. Thank you.